Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, Gaza's Untold Story by Ramzy Baroud. This isn't long. It weighs in at about 200 pages. It's shorter than 200 pages, actually. And I find this to be a nice parallel to the 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi, except this is shorter and less detailed. And this would be another, you could say, one volume to get someone oriented to Palestinian issues without them having to commit to a larger work. So if they don't have the time to read Professor Khalidi's book, which I think is at more than 300 pages, they've got room for a memoir interwoven. And I think that's something else to note. Professor Khalidi normally writes these historical books and doesn't insert himself into the narrative, but his life was part of what was going on with Palestine. And so we see that in 100 Years' War. Same thing here. Ramzy is talking about his father, Mohammed, and really wonderful story, amazing story really of his father woven into the story of the Palestinians. So we get flashbacks of his own family's experience alongside, you could say, commentary, political commentary on the situation. Woven together, great story. And it's in chronological order. That's how I'll be going today. So we'll start with the pre-mandate period. It became evident to the Palestinians that the Commission's recommendations were aimed at legitimizing what henceforth became the official policy of Britain. In the eyes of Palestinians, dividing Palestine was an unparalleled injustice. Not only did it undercut the system of the Mandate, which was meant to guide Palestinians, like other Arab nations, to self-government, but while it clearly sought full and meaningful independence for Jewish immigrants, it conditioned any Palestinian independence as being part of Transjordan, which was itself a British invention that hardly enjoyed true sovereignty to begin with. More, the report must have terrified Palestinians, for it effectively sought to grant 33% of the total area of Palestine to a Zionist government, whereas at that time total Jewish ownership didn't exceed 5.6% of the country. The Jewish state, the report counseled, was to include the most strategic and fertile regions of Palestine, including the fertile Galilee, much of the water access to the Mediterranean, and the cities of Haifa and Accra. The Commission went so far as to recommend forcible transfers of those who refused to leave the Jewish state. This, I'm referring to the Commission. This is the Peel Commission report. Haven't had a chance to review that for the channel, but we will at some point in the future. So this text is from the Peel Commission report. Considering the attitude which both the Arab and the Jewish representatives adopted in giving evidence, the Commission thinks it improbable that either party will be satisfied at first sight with the proposals submitted for the adjustment of their rival claims. For partition means that neither will get all at once. It means that the Arabs must acquiesce in the exclusion from their sovereignty of a piece of territory, long occupied and once ruled by them. It means that the Jews must be content with less than the land of Israel they once ruled and have hoped to rule again. But it seems possible that on reflection both parties will come to realize that the drawbacks of partition are outweighed by its advantages. For if it offers neither party all it wants, it offers each what it wants most, namely freedom and security. I mean, that hasn't aged well, has it? So moving forward into the mandate period, a reminder of the language of the Balfour Declaration. For in Palestine we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long tradition, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desire and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. So this quote has been repeated in many, many different books we've reviewed on the channel. But this is the idea that Zionism is all that matters, the Palestinians don't matter, and you here have it in black and white. Moving ahead to the 1948 period, obviously the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which happened both for the West Bank and for Gaza and for East Jerusalem. Here we get some insight into what life would have been like trying to survive post-48. Gaza was then home to a population of 80,000 mostly Muslims and a small Christian community that dwelt in urban centers, Gaza City, Han Yunis, Deir al-Balah, and a few others. The rest were largely nomadic tribes that were scattered all about the Strip. The sudden arrival of well over 200,000 people disturbed the established demographics of the Gaza Strip and opened the door wide for hostility towards the vulnerable refugees, who had no other option but to become exploitable to the highest degrees imaginable. They had no other mechanisms that would ensure their survival. Some stood in endless lines to receive rations and handouts from the Quakers, the first international organization that arrived on the scene to help the refugees in Gaza. Others offered their services to the relatively wealthy families in the area and were used as maids and cheap laborers serving the nomadic tribes. They often received a small meal as pay for their long hours on the Gaza farms, one that a mother or father would divide among their children. One meal a day was no longer frowned upon, for some families were hardly so lucky. A story haunted me for years, the tale of a distant cousin of my mother who stole away into the orchards to gather fruits for his family. After hours of waiting, his family began worrying when he had not returned. A few young friends decided to follow in his tracks, stealing away themselves into the forbidden zone. What they beheld was terrifying. The young man had been captured and shot, his body bruised and slashed, and his belly split wide open and stuffed to overflowing with plump, ripe figs. This young man, a husband and father, was one of so many apprehended by a sniper's bullet while trying to return safely back to a hungry family with the bounty from the many orchards that filled Gaza's countryside. Remember, they're always going to tell us the land was neglected. It was empty. And yet, how could it have been neglected and empty when in 1948 there were figs everywhere? There were fig trees everywhere. For many days following this event, family, friends, and relatives would in turn sneak into the orchard, this time not in an attempt to take fruit, but to retrieve the man's bloated body, but to no avail. Similar stories were plentiful, but such murders were not carried out as acts of vengeance. They were a harsh message to those among the refugees who dared to violate the new reality and break away from the open-air prison called Gaza, now assigned to them. It took many such killings for the refugees to refrain from entering the death zone and to brave other fences, those of the Egyptian army. So now we're skipping ahead to 1956. And if you want to learn more about 56, the book that we've covered so far on the channel is Joe Sacco, Footnotes in Gaza. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. He investigates the killings of Palestinians by the IDF during that year. Not an inch in that small stretch of land that is the Gaza Strip was safe from or immune to the sort of violence that occurred in 1956 to 1957. Over 1,200 Palestinians were killed in the war. Not one town, village, or refugee camp failed to report dead and wounded, and there were funerals everywhere. The same images of the barely distant past were once again haunting the refugees, those of funeral processions, mourners, and grieving mothers. A sense of loss and desperation followed every conflict, and a turning to God for answers. Gaza's local political leaders and clergy rose to the occasion. They reminded the panic-stricken refugees that, after all, it was Gaza that always remained standing when all conquerors faded away. This was the recurring lesson since time immemorial. Ancient Egyptians came and went, as did the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottomans, the British, and now the Israelis. And through it all, Gaza stood strong and defiant. Neither Alexander the Great's bloody conquest of 332 BC, nor Alexander Jannaeus's brutal attack of 96 BC broke Gaza's spirit, or took away from its eternal grandeur. It always rose again to reach a degree of civilization unheard of, as it did in the 5th century AD. It was in Gaza that the Crusaders surrendered their strategic control of the city to Saladin in 1170, only to open up yet another era of prosperity and growth, occasionally interrupted by conquerors and outsiders with colonial designs, but to no avail. Neglected ruins of past civilizations were only reminders that Gaza's enemies would never prevail, and would, at best, merely register their presence with another neglected structure of mortar and stone. Somehow the family made it to a tent in Gaza, just across the border from the territories that Israel demarcated as its own. Miriam left her children behind and desperately tried to find help for her husband and food for her family, a mission that proved futile. Finding nothing, she ventured into the death zone that separated Israel from Gaza. She was taught the route to some orchards, from which their Palestinian owners were expelled, that offered grapes and figs, and risked her life daily to fetch enough fruit that would feed her children for one more day. Her husband fell into a coma, and nothing could revive him. Miriam returned every day to the same scene awaiting her at the tent, a dying husband and malnourished kids waiting for their daily ration of figs. She would unfurl her scarf and feed them. The children knew nothing of her journey, of the snipers that awaited her and the other refugees at every turn, of the bloated bodies that dotted the border area. Zarafa believed that her father was just very tired because he worked very hard and required a long, long sleep. Thus, when she was called into the tent, as a group of weeping neighbors surrounded her father's motionless body and was asked to kiss his cold forehead, she didn't realize that this was her final farewell to her father and that she was never to see him again. This is emblematic of many, many stories in Gaza. The reason Ramzy tells it is because Zarafa is his mother. So this woman, Miriam, who goes and takes these figs for her children, she is his grandmother. And he is now training to become a freedom fighter, which we get the title of the book. At times, Muhammad convinced himself that victory was very much possible, despite the many worrisome signs that he had observed during his service. Hyped rhetoric, lack of preparedness, a confused chain of command. The voice of Arab radio never tired of conveying the same message, that the Arabs will triumph and that the oppressors will be crushed. Muhammad would go to sleep every night to the sound of Nasser's speeches, and would spend most of his day between training camps and trenches. Recruits would repeat after him as they would jump through hoops, climb walls, and hop through tires. Auda, Auda, Auda. Return, return, return. Oh, how they all longed to return to their homes and land in Palestine. So that was covering the period between 48 and 67, 56 period with the Egyptians in charge. And now we get to 67, the Naksa. On the morning of June the 5th, the entire Egyptian Air Force was destroyed, its entire fleet still sitting on the tarmac. Within the next 24 hours, the air forces of Jordan and Syria were also pounded. By June the 7th, Jordan had ceded Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank. By June the 10th, Israel had captured the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal and down to Sharm el-Sheikh. Syria was forced to concede its strategically and economically prized Golan Heights. Within days, Israel had occupied 3 times more territory than it had post-1948, if not even more. Other statistics were equally staggering. Israel had lost 766 soldiers, while between the dead and the wounded, the Arabs had lost tens of thousands of troops and civilians. Egypt alone lost more than 10,000 soldiers, and Jordan, much smaller in size and population, over 6,000. Demographic realities were fundamentally altered, as all of historic Palestine fell under Israeli control, and the Jewish state dominated 4 times as many Palestinians, a mix of previously and newly occupied people and occupied territories. In the West Bank, many villages were forcefully evacuated. New lines demarcated freshly designated security zones, buffer belts, and so on. Hundreds of thousands of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians instantly became refugees in Jordan, Egypt, and subsequently other countries. But 600,000 remained in the West Bank and 300,000 more in Gaza. The Israeli army reigned supreme and uncontested. The Arabs were defeated, not just in the material sense, but psychologically as well. What happened in June 1967 was not just a second Nakba, or catastrophe, but a Naksa as well, meaning a great setback. The term was not randomly coined, for it expressed the collective sense of complete dismay and disillusionment that permeated Arab people's consciousness at the time. So this is telling the story of Zarafa, so this is Ramzy's mother. What Zarafa didn't know is that Muhammad was far, far away in an Egyptian hospital, and that the nightmare of occupation was just commencing, and that thousands were already slaughtered on many fronts, and that dozens of Gazan men were being executed, and that Gaza was under the mercy of an army that lacked any such understanding of the notion of mercy. Worse, she didn't realize that she was pregnant. She slept under a tree, resting against its sturdy trunk, with her legs curled up and her head resting on her knees. She was all alone and she was afraid. She woke up to a violent commotion, noises, partly made in a foreign language with which she was not familiar. The voices drew near. They were abrasive and commanding, interrupted or joined by screams, submissive words pleading in Arabic, "For God's sake, don't take him. He is only a child." "I swear by Allah, soldier, my son has never hurt anyone. Please spare him, and may you return safe and sound to your own mother." Such exchanges would soon end with a hail of bullets, then silence, then more screams, and shouts in a language with which Zarafa was hardly familiar. But soon after, the commands were loud and clear, barking in a strange but comprehensible Arabic accent through a loudspeaker. "To all of those hiding in the orchard, come out with your hands on your heads. Those who violate the army's order will be shot at once." Hundreds like her, mothers with their children, old men and women, all began moving in one direction, some quietly whimpering, others in complete silence. This is the reality that the Israelis will never acknowledge. This is what they did to unarmed men, women, and children. To easily control the Strip, Israel divided Gaza into zones, and nightly raids would target one refugee camp after another. The male population of the targeted area would be ordered into schoolyards or any other open fields. Some would be forced to strip, others would be chained and paraded outside the camp. Some would be beaten, others arrested, and the most defiant would be shot, so as to set an example for the rest. Nothing different today. So after 67, the Gazan men are brought into a meeting with the police chief, I think, and they're given an opportunity to get cushy jobs. All they have to do is be informers on their own people to the Israelis. They said, if you do this, you'll get a paycheck. And it seemed as though most of the Gazan men were willing to accept this reality and just get some money for their family. But Mohammed, who's Ramzy's father, is not okay with this, and he gives a speech in front of the Israelis. "My brothers and my comrades, we are all joined by a common sorrow and fate. We all fondly remember the rolling hills and valleys of our homeland, its villages, towns, its farms, and its humble yet dignified way of life. We long for the days of quiet and peaceful coexistence that Palestine offered, and we grieve the loss of life, the assault on our dignity, the destruction of our schools, mosques, homes in hundreds of villages that are now a fleeting memory. Our struggle has been an honorable and worthy cause, and it is by far more precious than trivial salaries and extraneous police uniforms the invader offers. I would rather starve, along with my family, a free man, than to live rich in slavery with badges of dishonor." By the time Mohammed concluded his speech, many of his friends had joined him in his refusal to work for the Israelis. Soon after, Mohammed had an exhaustive and detailed profile on the Israeli military intelligence desk in Gaza. Mohammed Baroud was officially an agitator. Palestinians in the Strip were suffocated to the point that when Israel eased its military regulation and allowed Gazans to seek jobs as day laborers in Israel, thousands of Gazan men lined up at the border point, carrying a can of sardines and a loaf of bread in one hand, and their shoes in the other, ready to chase after any Israeli boss willing to offer employment. But why the chasing? Some Israeli bosses wanted to ensure that they would choose the strongest and best cheap day laborers. They would drive slowly by a crowd of Gazan workers dotting the border area and yell out what kind of work was on offer and how many workers they required. Then they would take off, allowing the fastest and strongest to jump into the speeding vehicle first. This humiliating practice was commonplace throughout the years and symbolically defined the terms of employment of Gaza's cheap labor in Israel. It was also common to see an old man being carried by young men as they would all run towards the speeding vehicles, so as to give elders an equal chance at earning a few Israeli liras, which was still the Israeli currency at the time. Although hardly acknowledged, Israel owes much of its economic prosperity in the years 1967 to 87 to the Palestinian cheap labor market. Evidently, the main advantage of employing Palestinians was that workers from the occupied territories, who paid heavy taxes on their little income, cost Israeli employers a fraction of what they paid their own countrymen. Moreover, Palestinian workers, especially those in Gaza, were exploitable. They received little pay, no benefits, no health insurance, no pension, and could be fired at any time and for any reason, for there were always thousands waiting at the border with their can of sardines and loaf of bread in one hand and their shoes in the other, ready to run and leap into the abyss of an Israeli truck. We pay income tax, excise tax, property tax, municipal tax, and other taxes, and we get nothing back. The Israelis spend no money on public works or health services, and extremely little on education and other services. The Israelis use our tax money to support their hated military presence. They use our own taxes to finance their continued occupation of our own land. The demise of armed struggle in Jordan would not have been sufficient in itself to weaken the resistance in Gaza. The additional factor was Ariel Sharon, the head of Israel's Defense Forces Southern Command, which was entrusted with the bloody task of pacifying the headstrong Strip after the 1967 war. Sharon was dubbed the bulldozer, for he understood that pacifying Gaza would require heavy armored vehicles. But Gaza's crowded neighborhoods and its alleyways, weaving through the destitute refugee camps, were not suited for heavy machinery. Thus, he resolved to bulldoze thousands of homes to prepare the way for tanks and more bulldozers to move in and topple even more homes. Modest estimates put the number of homes destroyed in August 1970 alone at 2,000. Over 16,000 Palestinians were made homeless. Thousands were forced to relocate from one refugee camp into another. Israel's message to Gaza was loud and clear. Arabs have graciously accepted their defeat, and Palestinians must comply and resign to the same. Resistance was futile, and the beach refugee camp, almost completely destroyed in a few weeks, was a stark example that Gazans were expected to consider then and always. Needless to say, the extreme violence to which Gaza was subjected in the years following the 1967 war, particularly the reckoning months of 1971, was not merely intended to terrorize the population into submission, but was a stern effort to restructure Palestinian society in Gaza under new ideas, slogans, and culture, a society that would be satisfied with the income generated through cheap labor and willing to accept servitude under an Israeli flag. The plan evidently didn't work, but it did in fact subject Gaza to a sense of collective shock, followed by profound introspection. Eventually it yielded an even more emboldened culture of resistance. The shock therapy to which Palestinians in Gaza were subjected, and the aftermath of that reality were not outcomes of one factor, but many factors, some specific to Gaza itself, others regional, and some international. Indeed, when Gazans marched to mourn Nasser's death, they chanted his name, decried the treason of the Arabs, cursed Sharon, condemned the Rogers Plan, reaffirmed their right of return, hailed the PLO, and swore to fight for their freedom, till victory or martyrdom. If you are enjoying this content, please consider hitting like or subscribe, sharing this with other people who might benefit and learn about what has actually been going on in Palestine, rather than believing the lies of the mainstream media. So we're moving on now to the first war with Lebanon. Mohammed was not just able to hear the news of the Lebanon war, which marginalized both Syria and the PLO, but he and his family was also able to watch the devastation wrought by the war. Mohammed's prosperity had resulted in the purchase of a small black and white television set. Since there was no electricity in Gaza, he operated his tiny TV using a giant battery, which he had to haul every few days to a car repair shop to be recharged. Mohammed's political commentary at the time was reduced to a simple mantra, which he often repeated while watching the news as he slapped one hand against the other. "We are lost. We are completely lost." I also recall him swear every time he saw Anwar Sadat on the news. "You bastard, you sold out for a standing ovation." His fits were often accompanied by throwing his worn-out shoes at the TV screen. Only then Zarafa would interfere. "Stop, Abu Anwar. Stop, for goodness sake. Will breaking the TV liberate Palestine?" Then Mohammed would direct his verbal abuse at her, then at God, Sadat, Arafat, all Arabs, Christians and Muslims, and eventually at himself, and storm out, but not without his pack of Kent king-size cigarettes, because they lasted longer. And I've said this before in other reviews, Palestinians have this wonderful sense of humor, even in the darkest of times. And here you can see Ramzy having a bit of fun with this with his own father. So we're starting to move. It's been alluded to by mentioning Anwar Sadat's name, the so-called peace era, or the attempt at peace. And what's some of the foregrounding for this? As for Begin's political agenda, this is Menachem Begin. Following Likud's election victory in 1977, it was indisputably clear. The Jewish people have an unchallengeable, eternal, historic right to the land of Israel, including the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the inheritance of their forefathers. Hence, he pledged to build rural and urban exclusive Jewish colonies in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Settlement of the West Bank, and to a lesser extent Gaza, was part of Likud's strategic plan to make sure no inch of Israeli territory would ever be surrendered. By establishing a large population in the occupied territories, it hoped to render politically unviable any future efforts by a labor government to evacuate the territory. In his speech about Palestinians, I think when he visited the Knesset in Israel, Sadat said, "The peace process comprises a beginning and steps towards an end. In reaching this end, the process must achieve its projected goal. That goal is to bring security to the peoples of the area, and the Palestinians in particular, restoring to them all their right to a life of liberty and dignity. We are moving steadily towards this goal for all the peoples of the region. That is what I stand for. That is the letter and the spirit of Camp David." And on its own, that would sound pretty nice, right? Here's what Ramzy says. But the hopes of mankind and the spirit of Camp David represented nothing more than a sentimental, although fleeting reference to the original conflict between the Arabs and Israel. As Sadat masked his new political program with trivial references, Israel was clear in regard to its future and territorial agendas, of which Sadat must also have been aware. As Egypt and Israel were capitalizing on Sadat's historic visit and prepared for the future peace treaty, Israel sent 25,000 soldiers to occupy South Lebanon in Operation Litani on March 14, 1978, a move that also exacerbated the Lebanese civil war. The Israeli attack on Lebanon was justified as retaliation for an attack by a Palestinian group on an Israeli bus in Haifa, which killed and wounded scores of Israelis. Politically, Begin was hardly misleading when he declared, during the Israeli-Egyptian peace negotiations, his intentions regarding the future of the occupied territories. Israel will not transfer Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza district to any foreign sovereign authority because of the historic right of our nation to this land and the needs of our national security, which demand a capability to defend our state and the lives of our citizens. But Sadat was not the Prince of Peace as far as Gaza was concerned. He had merely corroborated the peace process as a viable channel that would strategically strengthen Israel, further disunite the Arabs, and isolate the Palestinian leadership. Camp David freed Israel's hand to do as it saw fit in the occupied territories in Lebanon without fearing any serious consequences now that Egypt was no longer a party in the conflict. I've done a review on Oslo. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. As you learn more about Oslo, and before this, what we're talking about here, the so-called peace process with the Egyptians, you come to see that the Camp David Accords with President Carter were a disaster, and they set up for Oslo. So every time the world cheers for something, it is actually something very bad for the Palestinians. Over and over, and because the world doesn't really know what's going on with the Palestinians. So how do we get to Hamas? You have to understand what was developing in the 70s. The defeat of 1967, then the occupation of the Gaza Strip, among other Palestinian and Arab lands, was all that the Islamic movement in Gaza needed to appreciate the gravity of the new situation. It argued that armed struggle was not possible under the current power structure, and that for such a struggle to be successful, it would require more than firearms. It would require the engagement of all sections of society. Instead of battling Israeli forces, the Muslim Brotherhood movement in Gaza focused on society building and the espousing of an Islamic generation that would be willing and capable to withstand the future confrontation. As Gaza underwent various stages of growth and evolvement, from the secretive underground resistance phase to that of collective and open struggle, exemplified in the protracted strike of November 1981, the Islamic movement was also evolving, but based largely on separate dialectics, unique to its own political agendas and internal debates. Despite that exceptionality, however, internal, as in Palestinian, and external, as in regional and international, factors also had a role to play in the changes experienced in Islamic circles. The years 1967 to 75 were designated by the Islamic movement as the phase of mosque building. The mosque was the central institution that galvanized Islamic societies in Gaza. It was not simply a place of worship, but also a hub for education, social and cultural interaction, and later political organization. In the period 1967 to 87, the number of mosques in Gaza had tripled, rising from 200 to 600 mosques. The years between 1975 and the mid-1980s were dubbed the phase of social institution building, which included the formation of Islamic clubs, charitable organizations, student societies, and so on, which all served as meeting points for Muslim youths. So you have to understand this about where Hamas came from. It came from a focus on building a society around a religion. So culture flows from religion, politics flows from culture. It all flows from the religion, and that's the proper order of things. The role of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood was threefold: cadre formation and mobilization, passive resistance, and military action. Cadre formation and mobilization refer to creating organized support of the Brotherhood, basically through Islamic student organizations and electoral contests. Passive resistance refers to the Islamic participation in some mass demonstrations and political protests, such as the strike by the Medical Society in the Gaza Strip on November 26, 1981, which coincided with a comprehensive 21-day general strike in the entire Gaza Strip. The Muslim Brotherhood activists also participated in the 1983 protest demonstration commemorating the first anniversary of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and in the demonstrations at Birzeit University in the West Bank to protest the Israeli occupation of Lebanon. 2 student members of the Islamic bloc were killed. The third phase mentioned in the quotation above was that of military action. The Israeli army arrested Sheikh Yassin and a few of his colleagues in 1984 on charges of possessing arms and plotting military attacks against Israeli occupation forces. Those arrests and a few other minor clashes between Islamic activists and Israeli troops were seen as the advent of the third phase of the Islamic struggle in Gaza. However, there was little indication aside from these events that would point to a serious inclination towards military action on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. Nonetheless, these events underlined the consequential debate within the movement. Clashing with Israel was not an easily reversible move, which could result in the eradication of the entire society and its reasonably sophisticated, but certainly elaborate structure. But what the Islamic leadership also kept in mind was that further delays could hamper the movement's credibility among its members and allow the PLO to claim leadership status uncontested. In fact, in the early 1980s, a new splinter movement was on the rise in Gaza, Islamic Jihad, a movement that proved particularly poignant to the Islamic Brotherhood. On one hand, the Islamic Jihad, whose members had been at one point supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, subscribed to Islamic ideology and principles, and on the other, resorted to armed resistance as a means to satisfy these principles. That breakup of the Islamic movement challenged the phased strategy which the traditional Muslim Brotherhood leadership had used to rationalize its lack of involvement in political and armed struggle. But other factors were also important, notwithstanding the Iranian Revolution and the overthrow of the Shah in 1979, which presented tangible proof that an Islamic state based on mass mobilization was indeed possible. All these factors combined to excite and agitate some leading members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza who worried that further delays in upgrading their program could jeopardize the entire Islamic revival project underway. So once you understand that, you get a sense of how things developed in Gaza. It wasn't in a vacuum, and there were tensions between, are we working on building our culture? Do we need to re-engage in armed resistance? Do we want the PLO to speak for everybody when the conditions in the West Bank are quite different from those in Gaza? And all of this obviously gets us to the First Intifada, which I think is one of the most valuable parts of the book. We have not talked too much about the First Intifada on its own within the channel because that story is almost always included in all the books that we're talking about. So we haven't covered a book that solely discusses the Intifada. But what I like about this book is there's a lot of detail here because Ramzy was alive and he was a child during this time period. So we're going to get some firsthand accounts of this. The Intifada started, on one hand, articulating and venting Mohammed's own grievances, rejection, and disdain of the occupation, and the humiliating legacy it espoused. and on the other, making his regular trips to Israel most arduous and eventually altogether impossible. Indeed, the Intifada held a strange dichotomy for many. It expressed the outrage of a whole nation and articulated a sense of collective hope, while inexorably inviting untold harm, both physical and psychological. And we hear this over and over, that it was a moment of great hope, but in that great hope, they also knew that there would be consequences for their actions, and they accepted it. In the occupied territories, the picture appeared equally grim. Israeli Prime Minister Begin resigned in 1983 and was followed by Yitzhak Shamir, a right-wing politician and an ideologue whose ceiling for political compromise didn't reach beyond the possibility of limited Palestinian autonomy. In 1984, an Israeli unity government was established with a most peculiar leadership arrangement, as Shamir of the right-wing Likud party and Shimon Peres of the Labor Party, who had by then reinvented himself as a dove, traded the post of prime minister. Yitzhak Rabin was appointed to the post of defense minister. The individuals at the helm of the Israeli leadership constituted the worst possible combination from the point of view of Palestinians in the occupied territories. While Shamir and Peres served the role of the hardliner and peace seeker respectively before the international community, both men and their governments presided over a legacy saturated with violence, the illegal annexation of Palestinian land, and settlement expansion. While Peres is historically credited for engineering Israel's nuclear program, Shamir was a wanted terrorist during the British Mandate period in Palestine for leading the notorious Stern Gang. Facing no international accountability and confident that Palestinian resistance in the occupied territories was duly subdued, the new government continued the policy of land confiscation and heedlessly initiated new settlements and expanded already existing ones. The number of Jewish settlers who moved to the occupied territories, including the already annexed East Jerusalem, between 1984 and 1988 rose by 80%, contributing to a policy of slow-motion annexation of Palestinian land and, predictably, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It's a reminder of that song from Macklemore, the Nakba never ended. It's just a slow-motion one that continues on. So now he's talking about the first day of the Intifada here in his school. All it took was one daring student to stand up in the center of the schoolyard and start waving a Palestinian flag. Students began chanting, praising the martyrs of Jabalia. Rest assured, O martyrs, for we shall carry on with the struggle. Mothers of our beloved martyrs, do not weep, for we are all your children, and so on. Within a few minutes, the entire school was marching, followed by students from nearby schools, and within an hour, thousands of refugees throughout the Nusrat refugee camp were moving in one large, unprecedented mass. Israeli soldiers quickly poured into the camp, some on foot, others in large military vehicles and small military jeeps. Battle was about to commence. Women, children, and elders were urged to leave before the troops arrived. Many young men also retreated. I was terrified and exhilarated. I was no longer a middle school student, but a student at Khaled ibn al-Walid, and could no longer justify my flight. I picked up a stone, but stood still. Others ran away, but some ran towards the soldiers with their rocks and flags. The soldiers drew nearer. They looked frightening and foreign. But when the kids ran in the direction of the soldiers and rocks began flying everywhere, I was no longer anxious. I belonged there. I ran into the inferno with my school bag in one hand and a stone in the other. Allahu Akbar, I cried, and I threw my stone. I hit no target, for the rock fell just a short distance ahead of me, but I felt liberated. I was no longer a negligible refugee standing in a long line before an UNRWA refugee center, waiting for a dry falafel sandwich. Engulfed by my own rebellious feelings, I picked up another stone and a third. I moved forward even as bullets flew, even as my friends began falling all around me. I could finally articulate who I was, and for the first time on my own terms. My name was Ramzy, and I was the son of Muhammad, a freedom fighter from Nusrat, who was driven out of his village of Beit Daras, and the grandson of a peasant who died with a broken heart and was buried beside the grave of my brother, a little boy who died because there was no medicine in the refugee camp's UN clinic. My mother was Zarafa, a refugee who couldn't spell her name, whose illiteracy was compensated for by a heart overflowing with love for her children and her people, a woman who had the patience of a prophet I was a free boy. In fact, I was a free man. As I finally made my way home with my shirt torn, my knuckles bloodied, and my face stained with tears from the tear gas, I saw my mother, running in a panic, barefoot and still in her pajamas, calling out my name and the names of my brothers. She spotted me and began weeping. In the years of the Intifada, curfews were imposed nightly at 8 p.m. and were lifted the following morning at 5 a.m. This continued for years, and in times of intense fighting, the curfews extended to imprison Gazans within their homes for days, weeks, even months on end. Schools closed, businesses closed, produce in the markets rotted in the stalls. Hunger was rampant, water scarce, and the boredom was often unbearable. With curfews that lasted for months, it wasn't long until families had nothing to eat, and ideas such as boiling the leather soles of shoes to make broth were jokingly entertained. But these dark times had their moments of glory too. It was the masked men, the terrorists, that pulled everyone through these awful and dark times. In the middle of the night, families would be awakened to the sound of a large parcel being lobbed through an open window. It happened many times that such gifts from heaven, bags of tomatoes, potatoes, bread, and sugar, were thrown into our house through a hole in the asbestos roof or through an open window. Without these valiant young men, who would surely have been killed if discovered with their contraband, we might have starved. But strangely, there are fond memories of the curfews as well. It was never certain how long a curfew might last, perhaps a few days, perhaps a month. We would be informed by army jeeps that would patrol through the streets and with megaphones announce that everyone that was seen on the streets would be arrested or shot. When the announcement of a curfew began to spread, everyone had their own urgent business to attend to. Mothers dashed to the market to stock up on flour, rice, or vegetables. Fathers ran to buy cigarettes, and young men sprinted in a mad dash for the video stores, where there was an abundance of Egyptian and Indian movies. It happened on several occasions that friends could not reach their house in time and would have to stay with us during the curfews. My mother would boil pots of hot mint tea, we would eat warm bread and salty white goat cheese, and we would play cards, watch Indian movies, and tell jokes for hours. Time became an irrelevant notion, and the presence and laughter of friends became a lifeline until the curfew was finally lifted. I've said over and over, and I will continue to say over and over, this is a resilient people, and resilient people find ways to survive. The Intifada was the answer to the rift in the Palestinian leadership and within Fatah itself. While Palestinians in the occupied territories clashed with Israeli troops, at a price of high casualties and frightening statistics, West Bank and Gaza intellectuals took on the task of articulating the political demands of the Intifada, also at a price of imprisonment and deportation. The United National Command of the Uprising was the culmination of the unity that was felt throughout the occupied territories, where every segment of society found itself, intentionally or otherwise, playing a role in sustaining the popular uprising. The UNC comprised the PLO's major factions, Fatah, the PFLP, the DFLP, and the Palestinian Communist Party. It was dominated by West Bank intellectuals, but communicated with the rest of the population through the community-based underground popular committees, which, among other tasks, circulated UNC's instructions using graffiti as a medium, as well as regularly issued leaflets. Unlike Hamas, UNC's leaflets echoed a purely nationalist line. In the wake of our people's glorious uprising and the need to promote the spirit of struggle and solidarity with our people everywhere, with faithfulness to the blood of the pure martyrs and our imprisoned brothers, and to express our resistance to the occupation and the policy of repression, expressed in deportations and collective arrests, the imposition of curfew and the demolition of houses, and in order to unite our revolution and our heroic masses, and in obedience to the call of the PLO, our sole legitimate representatives, to continue with the sacrifice and the valiant uprising, we issue the following call. My father spoke good Hebrew, which he learned during his years of business dealings in Israel. My mother spoke none, but even if she did, she would not have been able to articulate one legible sentence. After a brief pause, she let out a howl and cried out to one of them, "I beg you, soldier, my sons were sleeping. They have done nothing wrong. I kiss your hand. Don't break their arms. I beg you, may Allah return you safe and sound to your family." How would your mother feel if someone came to break her children's arms? O Allah, come to my rescue. My children are the only thing I have in this life. O Allah, I was raised poor and orphaned, and I don't deserve this. So Ramzy is giving us an account of a time which happens so often, which happens to this present day, of Israeli soldiers coming into family homes and destroying things, harming Palestinians. At first, the soldiers paid no heed to my mother's pleas and merely responded, "Shut up and go inside." But her crying alerted the women in the neighborhood who served as a first line of defense under such circumstances. Neighborhood women gathered outside their homes, screaming and shouting, as soldiers lined us up against the wall and brought in their clubs. The custom was for the soldier to ask the person singled out for a beating, "Which hand do you write with?" before breaking it with the club, followed by the other arm and then the legs. When the soldier asked one of my brothers the same ominous question, my mother's pleas turned into unintelligible cries as she dropped to the floor and held onto one of the soldier's legs with a death grip. The soldier tried to free himself as two others came to his rescue, pounding the frail woman over and over again in the chest with the butts of their machine guns. The big, bad, most moral army in the world, beating a woman, unarmed woman, with the butts of their machine guns. Remember, this is the most moral army in the world. As my father forced his body between the angry soldier and the desperate mother. Made more courageous by the violent scene, especially as my mother seemed to be drowning in the gush of blood flowing from her mouth, neighborhood women drew closer, throwing rocks and sand at the soldiers. What was meant to be an orderly beating of several boys turned into a chaotic scene where women braved guns and tear gas and verbal abuse by Israeli soldiers, who eventually retreated into their military vehicles and left the area. Thanks to my mother, our bones were left intact that day, but at a price. She was left bruised and bleeding. Her chest was battered and several ribs were broken. She was rushed to a local hospital and was incapacitated for days. Her health deteriorated to the bewilderment of the Ali Hospital doctors, who had hoped for an eventual recovery. Days later, doctors discovered that my mother had multiple myeloma. Apparently, she had been sick for some time, but her illness was exacerbated by the violent encounter, which made her prognosis bleak. With this, she announced to the family that she wished to die at home, for there was nothing that under-equipped local hospitals could do to help. My father would not even entertain such a notion. But how do you treat a cancer patient with broken ribs, without health insurance, with little money, and in an area that is paralyzed by strikes, curfews, and daily violence? And of course, unfortunately, his mother dies under these conditions. Nusrat was under a curfew, and the Israeli army agreed to allow her burial on the condition that only the immediate family was to be present, under the monitoring of Israeli soldiers. We arrived at the graveyard carrying the coffin and were soon joined by Miriam, Zarafa's mother, who came running into the graveyard calling out her daughter's name. We began digging, but neighbors peeking through their windows quickly concluded that Zarafa had died and was being buried. My mother was a beloved neighbor. She was particularly adored among the older women of the camp, whom Zarafa treated with untold kindness. Allahu Akbar, resonated a voice coming from one of the refugee homes. Anwar has died, cried another. Within minutes, shouts of God is great echoed throughout the camp. People appeared from everywhere carrying Palestinian flags. Women, children, old men and women, and youth all descended onto the graveyard. Refugees were outraged that the poor woman was to be buried, subject to military restrictions, and was to be followed, even to her grave, under the watchful eyes of the occupiers, their guns, tanks, and a hovering army helicopter. Youth began throwing stones, and the soldiers responded with bullets and tear gas. But the people were not to disperse easily this time. Thousands of them ensured that Zarafa would depart the earth and enter paradise in the company of friends, treated as a martyr should be treated. As an ambulance hauled some of the wounded to the local clinic, Zarafa was lowered into the ground amidst chants and Quranic verses recited by everyone. Shouts of Allahu Akbar were intermingled with the whimpers and prayers of the crowd, the sounds of bombs, the tear gas, and the hovering helicopter. My mother was 42 years old when she died. For those of you who've lost a parent, that is an unbelievable age to lose them at 42. Meanwhile, our subjugation continued. My neighbors still spent much of their days queuing up in charity lines where my mother once stood. Lines for flour, rice, milk, or maybe used clothes from some European country. They must have pondered many things as they waited for so many hours in those lines. Perhaps they thought it strange that the same insignia from the United States imprinted on the 2-liter can of cooking oil, or the 25-kilo bag of flour that was rationed to each family each month, was the same insignia on the random tear gas grenade canisters littering the streets of Gaza. Such were the ironies that we pondered, as Shamir and his like deliberated the, quote, humanitarian problem of the Arab refugees. I often pondered the afterlife and hoped that my mother could sense the gratitude I felt in retrospect for the boredom and embarrassment she endured for so many years in those lines in her children's stead. So the First Intifada does get us towards the Madrid conference, which was a sham, as is most of these other so-called peace process efforts in which the Israelis dictate terms and the Palestinians aren't even in the room sometimes. But what we do have here is a wonderful speech from Haidar Abed al-Shafi. And for me, it summarizes many things that we need to think about when we're thinking about the Palestinians. We, the people of Palestine, stand before you in the fullness of our pain, our pride, and our anticipation. For we have long harbored a yearning for peace and a dream of justice and freedom. For too long, the Palestinian people have gone unheeded, silenced, and our rightful struggle against injustice maligned, and our present existence subsumed by the past tragedy of another people. It is time for us to narrate our own story, to stand witness as advocates of a truth which has been long laid buried in the consciousness and conscience of the world. We do not stand before you as supplicants, but rather as the torchbearers who know that in our world of today, ignorance can never be an excuse. We seek neither an admission of guilt after the fact, nor vengeance for past iniquities, but rather an active will that would make a just peace a reality. We speak out, ladies and gentlemen, from the full conviction of the rightness of our cause, the verity of our history, and the depth of our commitment. Therein lies the strength of the Palestinian people today, for we have scaled the walls of fear and reticence, and we wish to speak out with the courage and integrity that our narrative and history deserve. Very well said. And what happened to the Intifada in the end? The petering out of the uprising can be explained by the effects of the repression, which decapitated the movement by imprisoning or banishing its leaders. Bereft of its battle-hardened political leaders, the Intifada was taken over by younger and younger militants with progressively less experience. The men resorted all too easily to violence, including violence directed against Palestinian society itself. There were clashes between rival groups, with particularly savage competition between Fatah and Hamas activists. In some places, however, the activists appeared to be more interested in consolidating their local power than fighting the Israelis. Probably it was to the advantage of the Palestinian leaders abroad to maintain a certain level of disorder in the West Bank and Gaza, with a view to weakening the emergent alternative power structure that had taken root in the occupied territories. A terrible thing to contemplate, but a reality that we have to know if we're going to speak intelligently about what's going on in Palestine. What happens after Oslo? A less intense but an equally determined construction program was initiated in the occupied territories, including Gaza, and even within my father's own refugee camp, Nuseirat. In the Gaza Strip, tall buildings were erected on the outskirts of refugee slums. Export and import companies were established by top PA officials and their cronies, who acquired massive funds from Western sources, with no accountability to anyone but themselves and their small band of benefactors. Lavish resorts, accessible only to the chosen few, were constructed as symbols of Palestinian economic independence, while the majority of the population struggled to survive. Indeed, Oslo had its rewards to those who chose the right side of peace. For those who made the right choice, the PA grew to embody the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian dream even. Hundreds of millions of dollars were contributed by Western as well as Arab countries to strengthen the moderates and fight the extremists among Palestinians. But much of the money was siphoned into private bank accounts, and more was used to cement factional divides. In fact, Gaza, like the rest of the occupied territories, began defining itself according to a new maxim: pro-Oslo or anti-Oslo. Those who were seen as pro-Oslo found better positions in the PA's many ministries and security branches, and accordingly received PA funding and other perks, such as free tuition for university students, and were granted Israeli permits to move freely. Those who failed the Oslo test were shunned, alienated, and often imprisoned and tortured. The PA has indeed become a hotbed of graft and corruption year after year. Moreover, estimates indicate that hundreds of millions of dollars, most from foreign aid and development assistance, have been lost due to corrupt governmental practices. In the past, several restructuring efforts have taken place, but the changes in the Palestinian Legislative Council have been superficial at best, with ministers accused of impropriety remaining in positions of power, often at the bidding of the chairman himself. Hamas's leader, Ahmad Yassin, didn't object to the idea of a ceasefire between the Palestinians and Israel. In fact, despite the Islamist tough language, Hamas, as indicated by its spiritual leader, was ready to sign a long-term ceasefire. And if you'd like to learn more about Hamas, we've done a review here on the channel. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Hamas, as indicated by its spiritual leader, was ready to sign a long-term ceasefire in exchange for a complete Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, to the pre-1967 borders. Yassin's qualms, however, pertain to the unreservedly compromising nature of Oslo, which lead to no real Palestinian sovereignty over any part of Palestine. Yassin communicated his message to Arafat. Hamas opposed the agreements signed with Israel because they ignored the primary issues, namely Jerusalem as a capital of a future Palestinian state, the Palestinian right of return, defining the borders, and the dismantling of Israeli settlements. He predicted that Oslo would in fact strengthen Israeli domination through Palestinian economic dependence, and warned that Israel would use Oslo to penetrate Arab and Muslim markets, while Palestinians would gain nothing of lasting value. Palestinian society has traditionally been divided between those who adhere to a secular way of life, concentrated mostly in urban centers, especially in the West Bank, and those who are moderately religious, concentrated mostly in refugee camps throughout the occupied territories, but primarily in the Gaza Strip. Despite common belief, Islamic fundamentalism, in its social, cultural, and even political manifestations, has hardly been a dominant force in Palestinian society. Oslo, however, polarized Palestinians into three camps: those who enthusiastically embraced Oslo because they personally benefited from it, those who accepted Oslo out of despair, recognizing its many faults, and those who rejected Oslo and vowed to defeat it at any cost. Palestinian society at large, however, was neither politically affiliated with those who embraced Oslo, nor ideologically allied to those who shunned it. Indeed, the middle group was placed in a most uncertain position and was eventually forced to cope with a case of collective schizophrenia. Its sense of survival compelled it to adapt to the PA's corrupt culture, for the latter became the largest employer in the occupied territories. And at the same time, it grew clearly sympathetic to those who rejected Oslo. That sympathy was founded largely on political meeting points, not necessarily religious ideals, which also contributed to the overriding confusion that gripped Palestinian society. Oslo was perceived by its supporters as a critical agreement that ended years of diaspora and isolation in the political wilderness. Yet in some odd way, and despite the return of thousands of Palestinians to the occupied territories, Oslo had in fact alienated most Palestinians politically, and even ideologically. What was meant to end the fragmentation of Palestinian national identity, wittingly or otherwise, served the exact opposite. Indeed, for ordinary Palestinians, Oslo represented an identity crisis. Remember that Oslo is always talking about the final status talks, and that's where we're picking up here. But shortly before the final status talks were meant to commence, Israeli intelligence assassinated, with a booby-trapped telephone, Hamas's militant leader Yahya Ayash in Gaza. Ayash was accused of masterminding several suicide bombings that killed and wounded scores of Israelis. The killing of Ayash, who was also known as the engineer, represented a watershed moment in relations between Hamas and the Fatah-dominated PA. As Hamas expectedly retaliated by initiating several deadly bombings in Israel, the PA was pressured to crack down on the Islamic movement, as it in fact did. By assassinating Ayash, Perez hoped to send a message to the Israeli voter that he, contrary to claims made by his Likud rival, was tough on security. Hamas's response, however, and the PA crackdowns that followed, undermined both Perez and Arafat and their peace process altogether. The average Palestinian can almost never define the differences between a right-wing Likud government or a left-wing Labor government. What a farmer from the West Bank or a refugee from Gaza sees are soldiers and tanks, checkpoints, bulldozers, barbed wire, land confiscation orders, and the same symbols of occupation and domination that never seem to change regardless of the ideological background or political leanings of those who rule Israel. But the advent of Netanyahu to the helm of Israeli politics, after narrowly defeating Peres in May 1996, must have mattered greatly to those who personally benefited from the Oslo industry and its generous revenues. Netanyahu, who served as Israel's prime minister up to May 1999, was an ill-intentioned leader. He rejected Oslo for all the wrong reasons. He regarded the agreements as unfair to Israel and promised to reverse the concessions made by his ostensibly ever-compromising predecessors. Seeking to provoke a sure Palestinian response and thus Israeli closures and violence, Netanyahu initiated a series of new measures that didn't simply undermine the peace process, but Arafat as well. At the age of 1946, Netanyahu was Israel's youngest prime minister ever. Although young and inexperienced, he represented a return to Zionist fundamentals, albeit with a modern twist. We have a couple documentaries that we've covered here on the channel for Netanyahu. I'll link to both of them in the description. If there's room for cards, I'll put them up. One is the Bibi files, and one is the Sky News documentary on Netanyahu. A master of the soundbite and tough on rhetoric, the American-educated Netanyahu envisioned a model of the Likud shaped in the image of Jabotinsky's Iron Wall philosophy and Israel's pragmatic politics of the post-Oslo period. Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion, is an academic and longtime revisionist, and the strong revisionist legacy was passed from father to son. However, Netanyahu sought to modernize and change the hitherto crude approach of the revisionist old guard and mold it using political vocabulary of the 1990s. Things get increasingly desperate for Clinton, Barak, Arafat as they're trying to close the deal, trying to get something put together, and inevitably this is heading for a collapse. Clinton propped up Barak as the Israeli leader who would be most capable of delivering peace, but ordinary Palestinians had few expectations, not least because of Barak's direct involvement in the assassination of various Palestinian resistance leaders in past years, including the top Fatah leader, Abu Jihad. In his first official meeting with Arafat at the Israeli-Gaza Eretz crossing in July 1999, Barak was expected to implement the long-delayed Israeli redeployment in the West Bank. But past deadlines continued to be deferred. Instead, another memorandum was signed in early September 1999, this time in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. The Sharm el-Sheikh memorandum provided a timetable and framework for the final peace agreement. But when talks resumed in November, Palestinians were outraged by Barak's proposal, which, if implemented, would have divided the West Bank into three parts and would allow for the many settlements dotting the West Bank to remain permanently in place. Thus, when Barak joined Arafat in Camp David, the latter knew fully well that Barak was neither willing nor able to accommodate the Palestinian demands of complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, the dismantling of the settlements, honoring right of return for Palestinian refugees, and so on. What Barak had tirelessly described as painful compromises didn't even meet the absolute minimum of Palestinian aspirations. In fact, Barak came to power with no decided peace agenda, but the same recycled rhetoric, which ultimately was similar to that of Netanyahu's before him. I tell you that the time for peace has come. Not peace through weakness, but peace through might and a sense of security. Not peace at the expense of security, but peace that will bring security. We will move quickly toward separation from the Palestinians within 4 security red lines. A united Jerusalem under our sovereignty as the capital of Israel for eternity, period. Under no conditions will we return to the 1967 borders. No foreign army west of the Jordan River. And most of the settlers in Judea and Samaria will be in settlement blocks under our sovereignty. In the long run, you, the people of Israel, will decide. Mohammed, at times, grew weary of news. When I called him to discuss comments made by Dov Weisglass, Israel's former chief of staff, and Sharon's closest personal advisor, he seemed disinterested and tried to change the subject. Weisglass had told Haaretz that the disengagement plan was intended to freeze the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, to guarantee that 80% of the West Bank's illegal Jewish settlements remained in place, and to eradicate any possibility of establishing an independent Palestinian state. All that with the knowledge and blessing of the U.S. government. What I effectively agreed to with the Americans was that part of the settlements would not be dealt with at all, and the rest will not be dealt with until Palestinians turn into Finns. The disengagement plan supplied the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. As a result, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. So, there you have it. And that gets us to 2006, when we have the so-called disengagement, where the illegal settlers were removed from Gaza, providing a template. We've seen that Israel has removed illegal settlers before, which means they could remove the illegal settlers from the West Bank. So we can't say it's never been done. The likelihood of it being done, that's a different story, but illegal settlers have been removed. And before that, in the Sinai as well. So after these settlements are removed and demolished hatefully by the Israelis, they don't want to allow any infrastructure to remain for the Palestinians. We have Palestinians going into this area. Salem, a young man from Nusrat, recalled his feelings after entering the settlement late that night. I don't know where all the bravery came from, but I walked towards the settlement after midnight. It was very dark, and I thought all of Nusrat was still asleep. I thought I wanted to be the first person to set foot onto the settlement once the soldiers were gone. But once I crossed the highway separating Nusrat and Baroud refugee camps and drew near, I discovered that I was not the only one who wished to be the first to cross into Netzarim. Crowds had already arrived, and hundreds of youths clashed with Israeli soldiers who opened fire. I hurried to arrive there. The people were so happy that Netzarim was evacuated, but so angry that it took this long and caused so much harm. When the soldiers left, the crowds began chanting, and some began demolishing some of the still standing walls. The Israelis took everything with them, and frankly, we couldn't care less. We didn't want traces of them in that area anyway. I was astounded to see the signs of the lavish lifestyle the settlers enjoyed as we were suffocating in our slums. Suddenly, I walked into a small mango farm. Can you believe it? They were growing mangoes while we were denied clean water. I must have eaten 1,000 mangoes that night. I would pluck a mango off a tree, take one bite, and throw it away. And then another and another. It seems strange. I don't even like mangoes. But it wasn't about the fruit. I just wanted to vent somehow. I wanted to claim a victory of any sort. And I'll choose this for the last passage I'll read today. From afar, Gaza's reality, like that of all of Palestine, is often presented without cohesion, without proper context. Accounts of real life in Gaza are marred with tired assumptions and misrepresentations that deprive the depicted humans of their names, identities, and very dignity. But it is not only humans who are casually reduced and misrepresented, but events as well. From the Al-Aqsa Intifada's early days and throughout its historical course, whether under the governments of Barak or Sharon, both presiding over equally lethal periods, the Israeli story was dominant and consistent. It asserted Yasser Arafat orchestrated the Intifada. This is the second Intifada. He had no intentions of reaching a final and comprehensive peace agreement with Israel. That is why he turned down a, quote, very generous offer presented by Barak at Camp David. We've never seen the evidence of this offer. At present, there is no Palestinian peace partner because they keep assassinating anybody prominent. And they even assassinate people they're negotiating with. Israel must do all it can to protect its citizens, even if it must seek peace unilaterally. Hence, Ariel Sharon's Gaza disengagement plan, which we know was really just a pivot to the West Bank. Every Israeli policy, political or military, was somehow explained and defended within these few lines. Within this discourse, neither Mohammed nor millions of Palestinians exist. They are either completely omitted, as if a negligible irritant, or exist on the margins. If Palestinians ever take center stage, the media assign them the role of terrorist or bystander, whose deaths are squarely blamed on the imprudence of their leadership. My father was a freedom fighter. Gaza's Untold Story, Ramzy Baroud. You can buy a copy using a link in the description. That's one of the ways that you can support this channel. Another, as I said, easy and free way to do so. Hit like, subscribe, hype, share this with people who you think would like to hear about Palestine from a Palestinian. If you'd like to thank me for this presentation, there's links to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee below. If you want to thank me on an ongoing basis, get access to early releases of videos like this one, get an exclusive once a month Q&A and commentary behind the scenes for what's going on here at Palestine Bookshelf, chance to ask me questions. There's links to YouTube membership, Substack, as well as Patreon below. You can choose any one of those platforms. If you'd like to nominate a book for the future, my Amazon wishlist is also linked below. You'll see links to all sorts of books, my regular Stephen Heiner channel, which just does general book reviews. If you'd like, you can follow that channel. But obviously any book on Palestine is for this channel. You can buy a copy, send it my way, and I will do my best to review it in a timely manner. A reminder that once the channel becomes monetized or breaks even, we have this also with our income from Substack, 100% of the profits from those channels will go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which is a medical charity that helps Palestinian children get medical care who could not otherwise get it. I also want to remind you of our fundraiser for the Hind Rajab Foundation, which is a sticker fundraiser. I'll put links to that in the description. We have various stickers of different sizes and the occupation from the river to the sea, and a little Palestine Bookshelf sticker down there as well. And 100% of the profits of that fundraiser will go to support the Hind Rajab Foundation. So please consider supporting us in these various ways. This project is solely for the Palestinians, as it should be. Until next time, enjoy your reading.